agradecidos de estas palabras de Paul. Con ello damos apertura a nuestra primera conferencia magistral, que será guiada por el doctor Kristian Bankov desde Bulgaria. Para ello me permito hacer su presentación. Kristian Bankov es profesor de semiótica de la nueva Universidad de Bulgaria y presidente del Centro de Estudios Semióticos del Sudeste de Europa. En 2000 defendió su tesis doctoral en la Universidad de Helsinki y en 2011 se convirtió en profesor titular de semiótica. Los intereses científicos del profesor Bankov se centran en campos de la filosofía continental del lenguaje, la filosofía de Bergson, la semiótica y la semiótica existencial, así como los estudios sociosemióticos y cuestiones de identidad. Desde 2005 ha estado explorando la cultura del consumo, mientras que recientemente su interés se ha dirigido en la cultura digital y el valor económico. El día de hoy nos acompañará con una exposición de un tema titulado Método semiótico para impulsar el desarrollo aplicado a videojuegos y otras experiencias interactivas. Esta conferencia será transmitida en inglés con su traducción respectiva a partir de los links que han sido enviados previamente a ustedes. Bienvenido, Kristian Bankov. Adelante, puede iniciar cuando desee.
Hello. Thank you so much for this very exciting presentation. Should I share the screen with my presentation from here? Yes. Okay. I hope you see it. So just before I start, short comment on the presentation of Paul Cobley. Actually, we have to know that Paul Cobley is the major ideator of this early career research initiatives on behalf of the International Association for Semiotic Studies. And this is one of our major commitments while we were in the important positions in IASS to promote early career researchers. So now I will present you something on which I'm working in the last few years. It is work in progress, as you can see, and actually I presented already part of these experimentations in the conference in Bucharest, where there were like 13 people following my presentations, but one of them is here. I see Ina Mercur, so I'm happy that there is a continuation. Okay, the first part is quite different, but then the second part, you may take a coffee while I'm presenting this same case studies. However, the major, let's say, focus of this presentation is to the early career researchers. I'm daring to present something quite unusual and experimental exploration in how interactive experiences can be interactive experiences can be analyzed, which is one of the biggest challenges for the semiotic method. Now, the main part will be to underline some leads of the textualist approach, which, by the way, choosing the textual semiotics as a target of critique is actually recognizing that this is the only existing rigorous method of semiotic inquiry which gave so far the best results in studying digital culture, interactivity, social media, and so forth. This is the model for, let's say, when I try to outline possible approaches to study digital culture. My intention in long term will be to create something analogous to the generative semiotic approach, to this semiotics of the Paris School, which as a method succeeded to gain and to gather the biggest number of scholars working within the same paradigm, knowing what they are doing and somehow creating outcomes as a community. That's why I'm somehow criticizing theoretically, or rather I'm trying to underline what, let's say, points, I call it the fallacy, would prevent that this method can be applied in the form as it is now, let's say, mostly based on the idea of written text for digital culture. Now, here, my first thought is that to model digital culture, one of the points which has an intrinsic characteristic of the textualist approach is a limit. This is the idea of fixation. Text is a fixing discourse in a written or whatever stable form. Work on a dead body, as they say. The textual is a discourse fixed in a written form where the usefulness of the results of textual analysis rely on the assumption that the text always remains the same. You have heard this assumption, this challenge. Actually, when Roland Barthes used this expression, this was a big provocation to the old style academic approach to study works of art, especially of literature, the death of the author. So the death of the author is a methodological assumption with great impact on the advent of textualism. In a much more specific way, Ricoeur defines what is a text. He claims that for it is when the author is dead that the relation to the text becomes complete and in a word intact. So you see, this fixation is a fixation for the text being once and for all given. Now, afterwards, we will see the textualist approach has been used to model, to analyze, to study digital culture. But my point is that we need a shift in the paradigm in order to go further and to grasp the essential digital culture, which is the interactivity. Now, here, the new part in this presentation is the notion of enunciation. It is the act of transformation of language, of langue into parole, discourse into text, the semio-narrative level into discursive surface. This is the very act of fixation, débrayage-embrayage, where the living semiosis stamps its trace into fixed writing. So the centrality of the notion of enunciation is also part of this textualist fallacy, also, although it is absolutely not an explicit one. It is just a suggestion where to look for the, let's say, incompatibility between the textualist approach and the internet. And I'm not the only one to study this fallacy. For instance, very, let's say, insightful and bright scholars as Ferraro and Zinna already in the early 2000s grasped this, let's say, deficiency of the interactive, of the textualist approach. For instance, Ferraro offers insightful critique of the textualist paradigm when applied to internet. Although his considerations reflect the state of the art of the global network in 2004, quite different from what it is today, he offers some valuable modifications of the notion of enunciation for the internet as flow enunciation and multi-voice enunciation. Okay. Alessandro Zinna, another very important semiotician from the Paris school, from Bologna, where I was his student, In 2004, again, in a very different context with different intentions, but with very similar result, also tries to adapt the crucial notion to the internet, speaking of enunciative prospectivism and fragmented enunciative space. So enunciation, this act of fixation of the stamp of the trace of discourse into a fixed form, is not the same in digital culture compared to what it is in the written text, in the real print of the stamp, of the mechanical reproduction of culture. Now, video games might be taken as an example for strongly formalized interactive experiences to illustrate better the proposal, but not as an object of analysis in themselves. I put this clarification because just in case there are people specialized in semiotics of video games, which I hope this branch of semiotics will prosper, here it is not the case to evaluate my proposal as semiotics of video games, because I take video games just as an example from outside, let's say. I'm outside the video game culture, although in my youth, obviously, I was addicted to various video games, but this period has passed. Here, I use them because digital culture as a whole might be considered as a process of gamification of every aspect of our everyday life in a way. And this is a very long discourse. However, I think the social media, the platform interfaces, the very logic of the algorithms which are ordering the content, which create our digital worlds which we inhabit, are very much inclining, affine, similar to what is the video, but in a less formal way. So what is the video game inside it is a strongly formalized version of what is outside video games, but inside digital culture. So I claim such continuation exists because video games are extremely large amount of phenomena, which, as we know since Wittgenstein, are absolutely impossible to put into the same category, but there is something which allows us anyway to refer to video games, independently how large this area might be and how gamification nowadays is a cultural process in itself, which exports the most efficient elements of this formalized system, which is the video game, outside video games, and implement this efficacy, this digital efficacy, into commercial, let's say, communication, into corporate organization, into, let's say, NGO initiatives, and so on and so far. So we have this gamification and video game as an example, but here it is an example. Now, what I suggest to oppose to enunciation in the context of video games, yet, because when I take this highly formalized reality, I introduce a notion which somehow corresponds mostly to video games. But again, my general purpose is to grasp the principles rather than go deep into the specificity of the video games. However, ludoproduction is the alternative way to try to substitute the fundamental notion of enunciation in the interactive experiences. Now, the Gray-Massian semiotic analysis sees the syntagmatic chain of development of the narrative on a surface level as a complex concatenation of narrative programs. The formal structure of each narrative program presupposes only two operations, conjunction or disjunction with the object of value. we know very well this scheme, this formalized formula, which is, let's say, the classic of structural analysis of narrative. Now, Ludo production is something which I call as a semioeconomic approach. Textualist approach opposed to semioeconomic approach. On the same level of analysis of an interactive experience, it is difficult to identify such operations. For the sake of analysis, it is far more pertinent to identify a formal equivalent of productive performance and consumption of resources. You see, this is essential because in already given narrative where everything in advance is decided, it is stamped, it is there, it waits your interpretation. It is a lazy machine which makes sense only when an interpreter put in action the strategies of narrative, which are, however, fixed once and forever. This is the textualist approach, the enunciation. The Ludo production, on the other side, is when you have a narrative development, because in the formalized world of video games, in the same way as in fictional works of art, which are fixed, in both cases, the reader, interpreter, player, the same role with three different names, is inhabiting also a fictional world. In both, we have fictions. So all claims of criticism of the narrative approach to video games, they can't say anything against the fact that both in video games and in conventional narrative and linear fixed narrative, we have in both cases our fantasy somehow getting in playing the game of the author, which opens in front of our eyes a fictional world. We inhabit this fictional world, but where starts the difference? The difference starts that in the case of fixed literature, our mind as interpreters is not taking any decision. You see, we have a play of amusement. We have a kind of guessing, kind of, as Umberto Eco will call them, deductive walks. We have interpretive, he calls it presupposition. So the interpreter is very active, but he's making presuppositions about what is already and once and forever given. Whereas in inhabiting the fictional world of the video game, the player, interpreter, reader is supposed to take decisions and to act, to accomplish actions whose outcome determines the course of the narrative, the course of the opening of new situations, opening of new fictional realities. So the narrative exists in one form and another in both cases, but in the first case, nothing depends on the reader as a final, let's say, outcome, although the interpretations may vary, but they are always related to the same source. Whereas in interactive experiences, in every turn, in every round, as we will see after a while, in every round, you have a different situation which depends on your ability, on your productive performance. You produce, the authors of the video games allow the player to produce, to gain, to accumulate values, to accumulate the object of value is something which can arise or can diminish. And this is the core element of the Ludo production, whereas in interpretation, you have only guessing, only presuppositions. So productive performance and consumption of resources substitute the conjunction and disjunction. Those are some schematic oppositions, which I left deliberately places vacant in the comparison because this is a work in progress. So presupposition versus decision making. Enunciation is very similar to betting because in many games, actually the player may decide the expenditure of his or her resources. In other situations, ludoproductive, it is out of the control of the player to decide how much to expend, but it depends on his skills to perform. Now, conjunction is production and disjunction is consumption. Now, one of the most insightful slogans of people from outside semiotics who are analyzing the ludo narrative, the video game narrative, the formalized system of video games, it is Castronova. And Castronova is unique because he applies economic approach, economic notions to understand the essence of video games, which, let me remind this, is one possible way. There are many parallel ways to approach what is going on when we are into a ludoproductive situation, but one possible way, which according to me is very relevant and let's say produce value in understanding better the interactivity, this is the economic approach. So I call my proposal semioeconomic, and the slogan, which I would undersign with the same, how to say, conviction as Castronova, is scarcity is fun. You see, we don't have scarcity in linear narrative. Our, let's say, pragmatics of the text does not presuppose any doing with the scarcity, whereas what makes the ludoproductive activity fun, what attracts millions of people to play games, this is because you have a challenge, which challenge in any case is you are limited in some aspect to achieve goals, which achievement depends on your opposition to scarcity. So what means scarcity? This means you have in 99% or okay, big majority of video games, you have scarcity of time. There is something which is running and then you need to perform actions and you don't have time and your time expires. In many other video games, you, besides the expiring time, because you don't have time, and usually the management of the time is one of the most playful resources put into circulation, you have also power. You have a reduction of power. So you have to cope in something narrative, fictional situations. You take decisions, you apply your skills, and then there is bars of energy which are going down. And then you need to perform better in order to gain, to earn power, and so on. And this is the very normal thing, or weapons, or number of shoots. Scarcity might be scarcity of financial funds. I will give an example with the video game Sims, where you have a kind of economy, but real economy. So you can play also directly with an economic situation, socio-economical situation. For instance, you may run a city, and this city, to run it, you have budgets, you spend these budgets, then you have to make happy other people, but the happiness of some part of your citizens, it's in direct opposition with the activities of others. So we have to manage a lot of scarce resources in order to keep a balance. And then your skills are the key to achieve, let's say, results coping with scarcity. So this might be really a good fundamental principle to understand. So how we can bring scarcity into kind of semioeconomic analysis, what has to do semiotics with all this? Actually, I think this parallel with the object of value and the object of value in ludo narrative, the ludoproductive reality, are the key, and scarcity works to make the difference. So static object of value versus dynamic object of value. Let me give you an example here already. I have already shown this. Let's take Tetris, which for many is one of the greatest games in history of video games. It's a very simple and, in a way, genius game because it's so simple and at the same time universal. Now, what made Tetris tell all these notions? Scarcity of time, higher value, and higher value for the. So you see, in linear narrative, when we make a structural analysis of a tale of a novel, usually every narrative program has its stable fixed object of value, the operations with which are either conjunction or disjunction. Whereas here in this, let's say, fictional reality is the resource of time, crucial time and space. So you need to combine spatial elements into temporal frame, which is reducing and reducing. And just to say it in other words, you have more expensive time towards the right of your screen. You see the value of time in the first slide and the value of time in the last one are different because here you need to move to make the same decision in a much shorter time. Every next round of the game is also reassessment of the economical parameters of the scarcity. Usually the further you go into a video narrative reality, the further the scarcity rises. So you need more skills, and your skills, as we will see, they are a semiotic operator. They are a semiotic, a narrative operator. So there is a very useful notion from the microeconomy, which is called marginal utility. So things don't have the same value all the time. Usually when you're hungry, the first burger has bigger value than the sixth or the seventh one. You see, it's because the first satisfies your hunger when you're really hungry, and then every next burger is with lower value. So you're inclined to pay a certain amount of money until the utility is, let's say, beyond your threshold of, let's say, frugality. So just one example of what we mean with dynamic object of value. You see here, the object of value is time. The time is scarce. And then the worst your play is the scarcity of time grows, and then the expenditure is bigger. Now, what might be a possible application of the semioeconomic methods? Each voodoo-productive sequence is established by determinate voodoo-productive goals. In Tetris, this is to complete number of wines. In Space Invaders, I give examples only with classical games, which rules are very simple, so they can be understood by everybody. But believe me, there are much more complicated realities where, however, this approach works, just to show the principles of scarcity. So in Space Invaders, you need to shoot all alien ships which are coming gradually towards you, and if you don't shoot them, the scarcity of time grows, and at the end they are so close that you cannot shoot anymore. In Pac-Man, you remember this classical video game, is to eat all of the dots which are in the labyrinth, so you achieve again things, and there are beings which are chasing you and which you have to avoid, and so on. So again, there are limits in your actions, and your skills overcome this scarcity. That means Minesweeper, to uncover all the squares without mines there, the chance is another semiotic. I mean, in every video game, the chance is a part of the semiotic. Your skills and the chance are dividing their, let's say, importance as semiotic operators. So all these resources, you have to achieve the goals. Scarcity is first meant that the quality of the play experience, the playful experience, but believe me, when you put memes on your, let's say, timeline, actually you are doing such things to obtain recognition, to obtain likes, to obtain something which is valuable for you and which is formally measurable. So when I say gamification expands, we refer to the play experience rather than to just video games. This means that the quality of the play experience, and I would say its condition of possibility in general, depends on the relation between the goals and the scarcity, constraints of the means for their achievement. Most often, video games create time-based constraints of explicit countdowns of seconds or an accelerated velocity of action or limited number of lives, but also scarcity of power, energy, weapons, as well as explicit economic assets such as money, property, productive facilities. Now, something very experimental, something very, let's say, unusual, but can we look in the interactive experiences for levels of, let's say, meaning making, which can find correspondence to the semio-narrative structures and semio-discursive structures of the Paris School way to analyze texts. So Tetris is a very schematic game. Actually, you can find a lot of reflections of scholars of video games to define whether it is narrative or not. Obviously, there are people who define, okay, it is narrative, but it is narrative in a very schematic way, as, let's say, when we reduce the variety, the manifold experience on the surface of a given text to the semio-narrative structures, you have things which are schematic in the same way as Tetris is schematic for, let's say, sims. Now, what is the point here? You have on a superficial level, I'm very,
5 minutes left.
Yes, thank you. And I think we'll do very well with the time, except that there won't be any for discussion. You have a game like Sims, where you have expenditure of money, you create families, you create any kind, and you have different resources. Now, if I have to expand this, and this might be an interesting and long case study, I can show that with the schemes of Tetris of allocation of time and space, I can represent much more, let's say, narrative-like experiences within the semio-discursive structures on a superficial level. So how the Tetris is a prototype of many other games where you have allocation of resources, you have management of resources, you have scarcity of resources. Tetris is the schematic level, and many other so-called narrative video games might be the superficial level. Now, analyzing experience narrative expected possible applications of the semioeconomic method. Also, we have very good examples how football is, the football experience, how is analyzed. So without going very deep into this, having nothing to do with semiotics, for instance, the football, the soccer, this game is analyzed in with parameters. You have structure of the teams, you have a lot of schematic representations afterwards when the game is over. Now, those who experience football and then can analyze this experience, and this might be a possible scenario for using the semioeconomic method for any kind of experience. This is, for instance, the expected goals criteria. This is kind of scientific account of the match between two teams, where for the goals there is a lot of chance, but you can have an objective parameter which measures in a relatively objective way the expected games. and so on and so far. You see, those are structural representations of the football game. So I think here we have just good ideas in the direction in which the semio-narrative, the semioeconomic approach might be useful to understand experiences. And believe me, this kind of analysis is useful not only for the spectators, which somehow do not fit into adult mode, but they are useful for the players themselves, from their coaches. So they study in a structural way what has happened. And there are a lot of tools which use structural notions to improve the next match, to train better, to perform better. So I see just some inspiration to develop the semioeconomic model in order to achieve analysis of the experiences in similar way as, for instance, the football game has been